Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Mark chapter 6, verse 30 through verse 56. This is after Jesus sends his disciples out. Then the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come with me privately to an isolated place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and there was no time to eat. So they went away by themselves in a boat to some remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they hurried on foot from all the towns and arrived there ahead of them. As Jesus came ashore, he saw the large crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he taught them many things. When it was already late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is an isolated place, and it is already very late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "Should we go and buy bread for 200 silver coins and give it to them to eat?" He said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he directed them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they reclined in groups of hundreds and 50s. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. He gave them to his disciples to serve the people, and he divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up the broken pieces and fish that were left over, 12 baskets full. Now there were 5,000 men who ate the bread. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dispersed the crowd. After saying goodbye to them, he went to the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw them straining at the oars, because the wind was against them. As the night was ending, he came to them walking on the sea, for he wanted to pass by them. When they saw him walking on the water, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them, "Have courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he went up with them into the boat, and the wind ceased. They were completely astonished, because they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. After they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and anchored there. As they got out of the boat, people immediately recognized Jesus. They ran through that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever he was rumored to be. And wherever he would go, into villages, towns, or countryside, they would place the sick in the marketplaces and would ask him if they could just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. It's really nice. After the disciples' hard work of going out and talking with people about the kingdom of God and the gospel here, he says to them, "Come with me privately to an isolated place and rest a while," which, just thinking about the parallels between the Exodus story and Mark here, you have God bringing the children of Israel out into a desolate place. And while they're out in that desolate place, God feeds them with manna from heaven. But in this case, you have Jesus bringing them out into an isolated place. Can't speak this morning. And feeding them with bread and fish here. So, another interesting parallel. Which Anthony Rogers has good parallels between this and the Exodus story. In particular, like when they're out on the lake, Jesus sees them as they're out in the middle of the lake, alone at night, with a rough sea with them straining at the oars. which is interesting because he's still on the shore. How does he see them? But then he goes even further. He came to them walking on the sea, for he wanted to pass by them. Which, that language of wanting to pass by them is, I think, reminiscent of Exodus, where Moses says to God, "Show me your glory," and you can't. He says to him, "You can't see my glory, but he'll hide you in a cleft of the rock and pass by." And as God passed by, so Jesus passes by here. Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. The disciples came back from a successful time of ministry, being sent by Jesus into the towns of Galilee. When they returned, Jesus knew they needed a time of rest. Jesus knew when it was time to work, and he knew when it was time to rest. Jesus knew the importance of hard work better than anyone did. He said, "I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work." At the same time, he knew that we can only be most effective at work when we also take time for rest. Jesus and the disciples were constantly busy. There were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So Jesus took them away to a deserted place for some rest. The multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. Perhaps the multitude was rude and demanding. The disciples wanted to send them away, but Jesus was moved with compassion for them. The disciples often saw the crowds as work and as constant demands, especially at a time like this when their well-deserved rest was interrupted by the multitude. But Jesus saw them and was moved with compassion. Each face reflected a need, a hunger, or a hurt. Being a thoroughly others-centered person, Jesus cared more about the needs of someone else than he cared about his own needs. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus knew that without a shepherd, sheep were in a lot of trouble. They can't fend for themselves against predators, and have a hard time finding the food and water they need. Jesus was moved with compassion for the people among the crowd, because he knew their pressing demands were prompted by great needs. Send them away, for they have nothing to eat. Both Jesus and the disciples saw exactly the same need among the multitude. The disciples' solution was to get rid of the need by getting rid of the needy. Jesus saw a different solution and wanted the disciples to see it also. You give them something to eat. Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? It's hard to know if the disciples were angry or just couldn't believe what Jesus said. Clearly, they thought spending about a year's income to feed this multitude for one meal was not only impossible, but also a waste. Understandably, it never entered their minds that Jesus might provide for the multitude with a miracle. God has resources that we know nothing about, so we can trust him and be at peace even when we can't figure out how he will provide. Jesus' suggestion must have seemed so extravagant to the disciples. Jesus, if we have that kind of money, we would never spend it on one meal for this crowd. They annoy us and they would be hungry again in a few hours. Shouldn't the money be spent on something else? But Jesus will perform an extravagant miracle because he wanted to sit down to a dinner with the multitude, because he loved them. How many loaves do you have? Go and see. God's way of provision always begins with what we already have. He wants us to use what we already have wisely. Don't foolishly pray for more from God if you don't use what he already has given you in a godly way. What they did have was almost laughable. 5 loaves and 2 fish were about enough for 1 or 2 people, because they were small loaves and small fishes. Even though the amount was tiny, Jesus still started with what they had. He sat them down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. Jesus organized the multitude. He didn't want a mob scene. He wanted to have a nice dinner with these people. God likes organization, especially when it comes to managing what he provided for us. The ancient Greek word for groups is a very pictorial word. It is the normal Greek word for the rows of vegetables in the vegetable garden. When you look at the little groups as they sat there in their orderly rows, they looked for all the world like the rows of vegetables in a series of garden plots. He looked up to heaven, blessed, and broke the loaves. When Jesus blessed before the meal, he didn't bless the food. He blessed God for supplying it. The idea of praying before a meal isn't to bless the food. It is to bless God in the sense of thanking and honoring him for blessing us with the food. And so they all ate and were filled. Jesus miraculously multiplied the loaves and fishes until far more than 5,000 were fed. Seemingly, the miracle happened in the hands of Jesus. Jesus provides extravagantly, yet simply. As long as he was making food miraculously, he could have provided steak and lobster and any number of other great things, but he simply gave people bread and fish. When Jesus provides, don't be surprised if he provides simply. If someone left hungry, it was either because they refused the bread from Jesus or because the apostles didn't distribute the bread to everyone. Jesus supplied plenty for everybody to eat a good meal, but everybody had to eat for himself. Sometimes when we attend a spiritual meal, we gather food for everyone else except ourselves. He then sent them away. Jesus loved the multitude, but he was not obsessed with crowds. He knew when to kindly tell them to go home. He departed to the mountain to pray. A long, difficult day spent ministering to the spiritual and physical needs of the multitude left Jesus exhausted. But that hard day drove Jesus to prayer, not from prayer. He went up into the boat to them. As Jesus got into the boat with them, miraculously, the boat was instantly carried over to the other side. In John 6:21, then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land whither they went. Jesus rescued his disciples from working in futility. This was a miracle meant to assure them that he was in fact in control, and that he could always lovingly be there to help them fulfill what he commanded. We also know that it was on this occasion that Peter got out of the boat, walking on the water to Jesus. There is reason from history and subtle clues, not explicitly from the scriptures, to believe that Peter was the main source for Mark's gospel. If this was the case, Peter may have left out the story because he didn't want to be exalted for walking on the water or to be humbled for sinking. Mark does not give the incident of Peter's walking on the water and beginning to sink. Perhaps Peter was not fond of telling that story. But as many as touched him were made well. With the description of the healing ministry of Jesus, Mark concludes a brief section where we see the power of Jesus over the laws of nature. Normally, 5,000 are not fed by one small lunch. Normally, men don't walk on water. Normally, the sick are not instantly healed. None of this is normal, except by the power of God. Carrying on, Psalm chapter 40, verses 1 through 10. I relied completely on the Lord, and he turned toward me and heard my cry for help. He lifted me out of the watery pit, out of the slimy mud. He placed my feet on a rock and gave me secure footing. He gave me reason to sing a new song, praising our God. May many see what God has done, so that they might swear allegiance to him and trust in the Lord. How blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord and does not seek help from the proud or from liars. O Lord my God, you have accomplished many things. You have done things, amazing things, and carried out your purposes for us. No one can thwart you. I want to declare them and talk about them, but they are too numerous to recount. Receiving sacrifices and offerings are not your primary concern. You make that quite clear to me. You do not ask for burnt sacrifices and sin offerings. Then I say, look, I come. What is written in the scroll pertains to me. I want to do what pleases you, my God. Your law dominates my thoughts. I have told the great assembly about your justice. Look, I spare no words. O Lord, you know this is true. I have not failed to tell about your justice. I spoke about your reliability and deliverance. I have not neglected to tell the great assembly about your loyal love and faithfulness. Very interesting. At the start, I'm reminded of Jeremiah, which, I mean, I think this is a Psalm of David. For the choir director, a Psalm of David, where in verse 2, it says, He lifted me out of the watery pit, out of the slimy mud, and He placed my feet on a rock and gave me a secure footing. In the days of Jeremiah, you had him preaching an unpopular message, that is, surrender to Babylon, and give yourselves over to the Babylonians that you may live. And this was not popular for besieged Jerusalem, and so he was often persecuted for this message. And at one point, they tossed him into a well, and he sunk down into the mud. But he was rescued out of there by command of the king, and they lowered some rags under his arms to pull him up out of the pit with. And it's interesting with 40 verse 4, how blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord and does not seek help from the proud or from liars. In Jeremiah's case, he trusted in the Lord and what he had to say rather than any of those strong men who claims to be able to give salvation to Jerusalem. And 40 verse 6 is always good. Receiving sacrifices and offerings are not your primary concern. You make that quite clear to me. You do not ask for burnt sacrifices and sin offerings. Which I take as these outward shows of religiosity don't actually get us right with God. They are merely symbols pointing towards the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And you can see in verse 7, Then I say, Look, I come. What is written in the scroll pertains to me. In the beginning of Jesus' ministry, you have him picking up the scroll of Isaiah and reading from it. Goodness, I can't remember offhand. To bring light to those living in darkness, and release of bondage, and oil of gladness instead of a spirit of despair, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and things of that nature. And he said to them at that time, Today these words are fulfilled in your presence. That is, what is written in the scroll pertains to me. I want to do what pleases you, my God. Your law dominates my thoughts. Just the goodness of reflecting on the law of God and telling about the love and justice of the Lord. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me. The idea of David waiting on or for the Lord has been common, especially in the last few Psalms. In the previous Psalm, David waited upon the Lord without immediate answer. Here, the answer is stated. He inclined to me and heard my cry. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust. This is a natural and appropriate thought flowing from what David had just experienced. He knew by experience that trust, as shown by waiting patiently for the Lord, is blessed. A man may be as poor as Lazarus, as hated as Mordecai, as sick as Hezekiah, as lonely as Elijah. But while his hand of faith can keep its hold on God, none of his outward afflictions can prevent his being numbered among the blessed. But the wealthiest and most prosperous person who has no faith is accursed, be he who he may. From Spurgeon. Many, O Lord my God, are your wonderful works, and your thoughts toward us cannot be counted. David praised God as the worker of many wonderful works and for his thoughts toward his people. David knew that God thought about him and his people and thought about them favorably. Otherwise, there would be no blessing in those thoughts. In Psalm 8, verse 4, David wondered, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" He considered the greatness of the universe and was amazed that God would think about man at all. Here he took that idea much further and is amazed at how much God thinks about his people. By implication, he is also amazed that God thinks such loving, gracious thoughts toward his people, and so many that they are more than can be numbered. Starting in verse 6, here we enter upon one of the most wonderful passages in the whole of the Old Testament, a passage in which the incarnate Son of God is seen not through a glass darkly, but as it were face to face. From Spurgeon. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire. My ears you have opened. David understood that in a relative sense, God didn't want animal sacrifices. God wanted surrendered, willing servants. In Psalm 40, verse 6, 4 kinds of offerings are mentioned. Sacrifice, offerings made with blood. Offerings made without blood. Burnt offering. Offerings of total consecration, and sin offering, offerings to atone for sin. What did God desire instead of sacrifice? Obedience. This was true for David's predecessor, Saul. King Saul offered sacrifices just fine. What he didn't do was obey God. Ultimately, this was fulfilled by the Son of David. Jesus came and was perfectly obedient, and his obedience is credited unto us. Bless you. My ears you have opened. Instead of animal sacrifices, God wants servants who will listen to him and surrender to him as a willing slave surrenders to his master. The Septuagint, from which Paul quoted, has translated this passage, "A body hast thou prepared for me." How this reading arose is not easy to imagine, but since apostolic authority has sanctioned the variation, we accept it as no mistake, but as an instance of various readings equally inspired. From Spurgeon there. Anywho, Proverbs chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. The teaching of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the speech of the wicked conceals violence. Hatred stirs up dissension, but love covers all transgressions. The teaching of the righteous is a fountain of life. That is, it brings life to people, but the speech of the wicked conceals violence. It aims to bring death. Hatred stirs up dissension, but love covers all transgressions. Yeah, and we're commanded to love one another. So, let's do that today. And Lord, help us to love one another today. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a good day. Bye.